In the opening of the program an hour ago, the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is much more extensive than the single sentence that is constantly repeated by people like Tom Cotton, white Republicans, about judging people based on their character rather than the color of their skin. And he, as Kenyatta pointed out in the last hour, he really was, or would be considered certainly by Republicans today, to be a radical. And he was advocating some very, very specific policies. Let's look at some of those. Algernon Austin is with us. He's the Director of Race and Economic Justice at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Previously the director at EPI's program on race, ethnicity, and the economy, excuse me. Now, CEPR.net is the website, and Algernon's Twitter handle is Algernon_Austin, ALGERNON_AUSTIN, and of course, CEPRDC also on Twitter. Algernon, welcome to the program. Great to have you with us. Tell us, and I love this piece that you guys wrote at CEPR.net, Full Employment for All. Tell us about this program that Dr. King was advocating.
Well, this year is the 60th anniversary year of the March in Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And I think it's really important that people call it the March in Washington for Jobs and Freedom so that we remember, yes, as you were saying, so that we don't reduce it to the dream and a couple of other brief quotations, that the march was a jobs march, a march for economic justice and civil rights, both. Both were quite important to the activists. So on this 60th anniversary year, we really want to lift up the jobs part. So we have this Full Employment for All campaign that the Center for Economic and Policy Research and 9 other organizations are kicking off on Martin Luther King Day. And it's important to remember, yes, he was a radical. He was fighting very hard for economic justice. His last year, he was focused on the Poor People's Campaign. And both Dr. King and Coretta Scott King believed that the country needed a large government program to make sure that everyone who wants to work would be able to work, and that this was an important part of their anti-poverty strategy. And it's important to remember that in the March in Washington for Jobs and Freedom, one of the demands was for a massive federal program to train and place all unemployed workers, Negro and white, on meaningful and dignified jobs at decent wages. That's the quote of the demand. So economic justice was a fundamental concern and seen as part and parcel of what was necessary for civil rights and for Black advancement.
Franklin Roosevelt, I'm sure you know much more about this than I do, but my recollection, or it seems to me that Franklin Roosevelt was the first president to introduce the idea, or actually to implement the idea, that the federal government could be the employer of last resort during a time of economic crisis. And of course, Dr. King was saying the federal government could become, or even state governments could become the employer of last resort, even when we're not in a time of economic crisis generally nationwide, because there are these pockets of economic crisis that simply never go away. You talk about them in your piece at CEPR.net here today. In New Mexico and Arizona, Latino people suffering from joblessness. In Mississippi and Louisiana, it's mostly Black people impoverished because of lack of work. In Indiana and Michigan, Asian Americans who are without work. In South Dakota and Alaska, Native Americans want to work but are unable to find employment. Can you talk about that, the history of government as the employer of last resort?
Yes, there is a long history, and one of our partners, the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, has part of that history. They have a 40-year review of all the different programs that we've done, and they've been very successful Yes, we can go back to the WPA programs, which were very effective and responding to the Great Depression. But there have been others. Unfortunately, many of the others were small scale and demonstration projects. But the review of the literature shows that these programs are very effective at putting people back to work and increasing their income, reducing poverty, reducing crime, has benefits to individuals, to families, to communities. So we really need to have a large federal program that's targeted to these pockets of high joblessness. So for now, people might say, well, right now the economy is too hot and we're at full employment. And yes, overall, looking at the national statistics, it looks very good. But while the national unemployment rate last year averaged about 3.6%, in Gary, Indiana, it was about 8%, so more than twice. In Flint, Michigan, it was about 11%, in the double digits. If you look at Washington, D.C., among Black people in D.C., it's, again, about 11% in the end of last year. So the national statistics look very good, but there are many communities that are still dealing with high unemployment, still dealing with double-digit employment. And the federal government, we're a very rich country, has the capacity to target these communities with subsidized employment and really help reduce joblessness, reduce poverty, reduce crime, spur economic development in these communities that have been left behind. So this is what Martin Luther King Jr. was focused on, and this is what he has explicitly called for if you look at his writings around jobs and labor. So we really, if we want to commemorate Martin Luther King, we have to pay attention to his economic justice concerns.
We're talking with Algernon Austin. He's the Director of Race and Economic Justice at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR.net. You're calling for this program of, I'm calling it government as employer of last resort. I'm sure you've got a different name for it. And you've got all these organizational endorsements, obviously CEPR, Center for Law and Social Policy, Community Change Action, DC Fiscal Policy Institute, Economic Policy Institute, Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, the Heartland Alliance, Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, Labor and Working Class History Association, the Ohio River Valley Institute, and a whole bunch of individuals who've signed on with this. Can you tell us what the specifics are of the program that you're calling for?
Well, we are calling for a targeted federal subsidized employment program. So in every state in the nation, I gave some examples before, there are communities that are facing high levels of joblessness today. And it's very important if we want these communities to share in prosperity, that we enable both the private enable the public sector to create jobs. There are lots of work that the public sector can do and does best, frankly. And that should be subsidized. There are nonprofit organizations that have work and activities that they want to do, and then there are also for-profit organizations that could benefit. I've given the example of food deserts. Now we can talk about DC again. In the southeast DC, it's a very large area, and there's only one grocery store. Now it's hard to get grocery stores into that community, but if the labor costs were subsidized somewhat by the federal government, that changes the calculus. So that could really help bring grocery stores to food deserts. And again, we see this joblessness in every state in this country. There are pockets of high levels of joblessness that need assistance, that need subsidized employment. And it can be the public sector, it can be the nonprofit, it can be for-profit, to allow people who want to work, to make an income. So that's the program. It's let's use our resources to target these communities that have been left behind.
It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Algernon Austin, the Director of Race and Economic Justice at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. You can read all about it at cepr.net, Algernon_Austin or CEPRDC on Twitter. Algernon, thanks so much for dropping by.
Thank you very much.
Great meeting you. We'll be right back.